default, there's going to be too much bump happening on the surface. You can see it's producing a really cool effect, but it's too strong. So if you drop it down to 6, you can see that effect. It's still there, it's still distorting the surface, but it's not overloading the surface with too much detail. Remember, we still need to make it look like a relatively flat, clean surface. There's lots of tiny, small detail in the rust, but the green material is relatively flat. So with that enabled, I'm just going to re-render the scene just to give you an update of where we're at. And remember, I'm only rendering the base coat here, so we're not going to have those nice glossy reflections over the top. Sorry, I've just accidentally left the override on. Pause it and I'll start it up when it's done. So as that's rendering, you can see the importance of having some smaller bump details in the surface. It just makes things look more realistic. If you don't have that stuff in there, your eye treats it as a CGI surface because it's so perfect. You know, you need distortion, you need those little details, they all add up. So the darkness from the diffuse, the bump map here, you'll see in a second I'm about to add another layer of detail into this bump map. But down here we've got areas where it looks like the surface has been banged, distorted, you know, where it could be handmade, anything to distract the eye from seeing perfection. All those things contribute to the realism of the shader. One thing that's missing though is we've got this really nice bump mapping happening, but it's not related to the glossy map. Now you have to remember, from a theoretical point of view, this glossy surface where it's more blurry is because there's micro noise in the surface. So basically it's the exact same material. The only reason it looks different is because you've got more light getting trapped in little bumps and crevices at a microscopic level. So in the Burke on noise, I'm going to need to make this a composite material. I'm just going to load up this preview here so we can see it. So once again, in the bump map, I'm going to make it a composite. I'm going to keep the old. I'm going to add a new layer. And now going back out, the same map that was used for the reflection glossiness is going to be plugged into the bump map. Now you can see that one single metal texture. I haven't needed to load in different versions of it. I haven't needed to load in like different sizes or scales of it. It's all the same map because in reality, all those things are tied together. The glossiness is tied to the bump mapping, the reflection, you know, the reflection's tied to that single map that's controlling the entire shader. It's just different values are going to create a more realistic or less realistic effect. So I'm going to paste that in over the top, and now the first thing that you'll notice happens is we get heaps of detail in the shader, and it doesn't look anything like what we're seeing here anymore. The reason is because it's just too strong. So we need to set this to multiply. So now what that's doing is it's multiplying the dark areas into the Burke on texture we just had. So I'll just hide that layer on and off, and you can see what that's doing. Because here we've got nice low frequency detail doing subtle distortions on the surface, but we don't have the nice little micro detail that's going to give you that, you know, little bumpy highlight. So I'm just going to set that to multiply, and I'm going to reduce the opacity of that map down to 10. Now you'll see that there's a lot less being pushed through the material. As I go up, it becomes incorporated more and more into the shader. So let me just do a little region render over this highlight area. And it's kind of hard to see the effect of that bump. Now the reason is because we're seeing the bump on a very blurry surface. This material being rendered isn't the entire material. So now it's a time where we need to go and see the effect overall. So cancel the render. I'm just going to copy that map, that bump map, and now going into the main material in the coat 1 and 2, I'm going to paste that as an instance. So the bump stays identical. The bump intensity stays identical. And now we've got all three layers with that same bump. So you can see with and without that top coat, it's just distorting the surface. So now I'm going to apply the overall material. And we're just going to re-render again. As that's rendering, you can see now all the little micro detail that's just been added to the surface. It gives it a real solid feeling, like, you know, it's dense, like it's not just some flat, crappy surface that's got no detail in it. If you zoom in here, it holds up, that detail holds up, which is extremely important in convincing people that something's real, adding that layer after layer of detail. You can see it's not too complex to implement. You've just got to do it in a way that's easy to follow and easy to understand mentally, because there's a lot of information in the shader. You just don't want it to get away from you. You don't want way too many maps involved. And interestingly, I'll just tell you while that's rendering, this entire process of learning material creation has always been in my head 10 times more complex than it actually is to implement. The reason is it's just human nature. It's human nature to overcomplicate things. And everything I've learned in life has always taught me to take a step back and break it down into the different elements. It's so easy to, if your task was simply just to recreate the bump mapping on this surface, that's so much easier than telling yourself to recreate the entire shader at once. If you just break it down into, okay, now I'm going to go in and make the bump mapping. Now I'm going to go in and set the glossiness. If you do it all one by one, and if you do it all correctly and in a focused state of mind, you'll end up with a material that looks very similar to reality. V-Ray does all the work for you. So I'll just pause that. I'll pause the recording now just so it's officially fully rendered. So the render's done, and now we've finished creating that base green material. You can see it looks very realistic. There's heaps of detail in it, and not many people are going to be able to pick that from reality who aren't experienced in obviously looking at CG all the time. So we've got 3 different layers in the material now, but we're obviously missing the rust. So most people would try and tackle that rust inside one shader. So you'd have the diffuse map would incorporate the rust, the reflection amount would incorporate the rust. It's not a realistic way of doing things. You need to start looking at materials in 3D as how they occur in reality. So let me explain. This rust material is a completely different material to the green metal here. It's composed of entirely different molecules. It's got a completely different BRDF. It's got a different glossiness, different diffuse amount. Every single thing in that material is different. So it makes no sense to overcomplicate things and try and embed all that information in one shader. So the beauty of the V-Ray blend material is you're able to separate that. Now, of course, there is a rendering time hit there, but I work in print, and it doesn't matter how long the render takes. If you've got the render optimized correctly, if you need detail in there, you need detail. Like if it doesn't hold up, it's as simple as that. You need detail to make things realistic. That's the business I'm in. So I try and make everything look as realistic as possible. So in this material, there's still a couple of little things missing here. You can see in the crevices, we've got dust occurring, and we've also got this red rust type material. Now I've already gone in and made textures for that, just to simplify this process once again. I don't want to overload you. As we improve, and as you improve on creating nice clean shaders, and you fully understand that, then we can add in that next kind of level of detail where I show you how to create the textures themselves. But for now, as a guideline, you can use the textures I've already created on this shader and incorporate them into other materials. So let's get started on making the rust material. So as you can see here, that rust material is its own material embedded into the core, embedded over the top of the main shader. So we need to go in and recreate this material from scratch, and I'm not going to do it using any reference. I'm just going to recreate kind of a rusty material based on, loosely based around this surface. It doesn't need to be exact because we don't have a very good reference for the rust. Ideally, you'd like to know what this material would look like on the entire surface, but instead we've only got little snippets. So let me just render what I've already created, and then we'll go in and recreate that. So the render's done, and you can see the rust material I've created. Now it's not as realistic as the other materials, and the reason is because I haven't gone in and spent the same amount of time making this realistic as the main green material. Now that's another thing you need to factor in when you're making materials. You don't always have 2 or 3 days to sit there narrowing down every single little value. So if we take a look at the Photoshop file again, you can see that that rust is only appearing in small areas. So your eye naturally isn't focused on those parts. Your eye's focused on the green parts of the shader. Now, the rust is there, but another interesting fact is that the human eye naturally tends to kind of shift towards more beautiful areas as opposed to dirty areas. It's just a natural human thing we do where we focus on the pretty parts and not the ugly parts. So using that information, we can get away with having a slightly less realistic rust shader as long as it's blended in correctly. But the first thing we need to do is we need to go in and first make that shader itself. So that's what we're going to get into right now. So I'm going to make another V-Ray material. Now this rust material has only got one layer. The reason for that is because the glossiness on the highlights and reflections is so spread that you can't visually tell that there's multiple specular lobes. Now at a microscopic level, interestingly enough, that functionality is still there, but at a larger scale, when you start to see the combined effect of having a really rough surface, you lose some of those properties in a visual sense. But if I were to zoom in on one tiny small spot of this rust in real life, down to like only a couple of little chunks of it, it would still have that same effect of becoming more and more like a mirror surface near the edge. So just be aware that just because it's happening in reality, you don't need to always add it. You only need to add the features of the material that are going to make a visual difference to the scene. So for this rust, we can just get away with using a standard single V-Ray material. In the bitmap slot, I'm just going to load this texture I've already created. Now by default, this texture isn't correct. And what I found is whenever creating materials is that a lot of the time the default diffuse values or any single map you put in, it's never correct. You always need some kind of output map, some kind of color correction map to get things narrowed down a little bit more. It's that type of detail that I've been kind of pushing into you guys that you need to keep focusing on. So Max has quite a great amount of control over maps, maybe not in the best way, but for this map I'm going to put a color correction over the top. And never use the standard brightness and contrast. What it does is it damages your map quite a lot. So you can see here if I load up a preview, dropping this brightness down, I don't know, whoever coded it obviously has no idea what 3D artists require, but leave that for another day. Won't slam Autodesk too hard in this video. Same thing as the contrast, it just doesn't do a very nice job. It's behaving like like Photoshop does in the old days. So what I do is I swap to advanced, and I like changing stuff here. So now when I drop the contrast down, it's doing a much better job of adjusting the contrast in the image. Just going to drop that to 0.85, and I'm going to desaturate it just a little bit. Cool. So there's the diffuse component. In the reflection, remember this rust still is very reflective at glancing angles. So once again, you need to put a fall off map in there. I'm just going to leave it as mono. Actually, I'll put it at RGB and I'll incorporate a little bit more red in the reflection. Just drop that way down. And now I'm going to untick the green and blue, and I'm just going to up the red slightly. Now you see a little bit of color kick into the reflections. Now for the reflection glossiness, we're going to need a couple of different maps to produce a detailed result. Let me just render this where we're at so far. And first thing I can see is that there's not enough detail in that diffuse texture. It's not holding up. It's becoming pixelated. So I need to adjust the repetition on that map. So I'm going to go in there and make that 2 out of 2. The reason I'm doing this first is because if I go in and start adding reflection glossiness and everything on the wrong scaled textures, I'm going to have to redo that for all of them. So it's better to do that at the start, just see. So with 2 by 2, you can always see in the viewport, I guess. It's just a bit more detailed now, and it should hold up at the resolution we're rendering at anyway. And that detail is just, it's not pixelated anymore, which is great. So I'm going to go into the reflection glossiness, and I'm going to put a Burcon noise texture in there. I'll just put the values in for that, which I know kind of by default kind of the scale of the scene. I'm going to make it Perlin. I'm going to leave it at Perlin, and I'm going to set the fractal to FBM turbulence. Now, one of the problems with Burcon is there's some things that are absolutely amazing about it, and other things that are terrible. One of the bad things is you can't see some previews sometimes, so you kind of need to change the scale to see what's going on there. So I'm going to change that back to 1 in the end, but for now I'm just going to leave this in a way that's easy to see what's going on. Just going to play with some settings here. I just want a little bit darker, and now I can drop that back. That's good. Actually, I'll just go up once more and add one more level of detail in there and set it back to 1. So in the glossiness now, it's extremely glossy, extremely blurry, but we don't have much detail in it. So I need to make that a composite map as well. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to overlay another Burcon map through that. And this time the map's going to be smaller, so we're getting some micro detail in there. The same thing, it's just going to be set to FBM turbulence. And 4. And just set that to 0.1 also. So it's basically the same map, just slightly different size and intensity. So I can just fade that down now, and as I fade it through, you start to see that that map is affecting the base as well. Just like Photoshop blending 2 layers together. So now we've got large scale bump and large scale values and small scale values embedded into the map. One last thing I'm going to do is I'm going to overlay the rust texture. So I'm going to add one more map, and I'm going to load in this rust glossiness. And I'm going to set that to addition. So what that does is, in the high spots of our rust texture, so in the wider areas, the map becomes more glossy, more little sharp highlights are going to appear in those areas. So once again, putting this texture through is very similar to how we were putting the glossiness through the green material. So you always want similar values being pushed into different areas. So if the texture goes a little bit brighter, quite often the material becomes a bit more glossy. We don't want it to go too bright. I'm just going to darken that a little bit. And now we've got a kind of a starting point for our shader. One thing you'll notice is I always seem to make this mistake because I do things intuitively, like kind of subconsciously at this point, is I didn't untick the Fresnel. So now you can see what the actual effect is going on there. So with that set up, I'm going to copy this whole structure, this whole composite structure from the reflection glossiness. First, I'm just going to up this to 90 as well in the reflections, and now I'm going to paste that into the bump slot. And now the material becomes extremely bumpy. I'm just going to drop that down to like 10 and re-render this material. So as that's rendering, you can see now that it looks okay, but the problem is the diffuse map is just so overpowering. There's so much contrast in the diffuse map that the material itself starts to look very fake. So the easiest way to overcome that is to blend through a solid color into the diffuse map. So I'm just going to cancel that render. I'm going to go into the diffuse slot and put a composite map over again. Keep it there. And now over the top, what I can do is I can put a V-Ray color, set it to something similar to the overall color of the rust. Something like that, just a bit kind of brown, red values. And I can blend that through. So now the diffuse texture looks a lot more realistic, as opposed to that, you've got something a bit more like that. So if I re-render this material again, that one change is going to make a huge difference to the realism. So I'm just going to cancel that and just double check something in the shader. In the glossiness on this top coat, what I forgot to do is I forgot to set the tiling correctly. You'll notice we set the diffuse to be 2 by 2. You've got to make sure that stays the same for the reflection glossiness as well. But it is looking like rust now. It's looking pretty decent. The bump might be a little bit strong compared to our reference here. You can see it's fairly flat. So I'm going to lay off the bump a little bit and set that to 5. And I'll re-render. Now that the rust has rendered, we can see it looks pretty good. It's got a kind of weight to it because once again we've got so much detail that even at high res there's enough visual interest there to keep the brain occupied and not settle on low detail areas. So even if detail's subtle, it's still got to be there. So now we've got two materials. We've gone in and we've created the rust and we've created this green material. Now we need to blend them. So that can all be incorporated into the same V-Ray material. So let's go into the main material we've started to create and drag this rust shader over into the top. Now an important thing to note is with the V-Ray blend material is that it's a layered system. So imagine Photoshop but inverted. So the base material is here, and then every material going down is like you're layering it over the top. So say it was a more realistic way of setting it up would be to have the base down here, then your top goes on over that, then your next coat goes over that, and you just keep layering upwards. I think for the sake of whatever reason, they've just made it so that it's the opposite of that. But basically as we're working down, we're adding materials over the top of the previous material. So this rust has been added in, and you can see now, once this material preview renders, that we've got two different materials perfectly blending. So in order to fix that, we need to put a map in. One last thing I'm going to do is, because I once again forgot, I'm going to go into the rust shader, and in that glossiness map, drag the blurriness down. Do that for every single map, because what that's doing is at render time, it's filtering the texture to be more blurry, so that when V-Ray samples pixels, it doesn't have to do as much AA. But now that you understand how V-Ray's AA works and are able to control it better, you can take down the filtering and still have really nice clean AA because you're targeting it where it needs to. So from now on, I'm just going to get you to remove the blurriness from all your textures unless the texture is so noisy that V-Ray just can't handle it. But 99 out of 100 times, you can just remove that filtering. Cool. So like I was saying, we need to go back up. I'm just going to name this rust. And we need to put a map into the blend slot. Now I've already prepared one. It's just a more contrasty version of the rust, which you can see here. So the white areas are going to be where our rust goes, and the black is going to be where the green material goes. I'm going to take the filtering off of that. And now if we look here into the material preview, we've got two different materials happening at the same time, which is great. It's going to look really good. I'll just render that just to show you where we're at. So I don't need to let the whole thing finish. I can just I can already see now that what I've got there is looking great, but I know that I haven't added in dust yet, and that's one thing that I think every kind of dirty old shader needs. So let me just cancel this render because there's no point waiting to see the whole thing, and we'll go back into Photoshop, and I'll show you that it's happening around these edges and things like that. So things in crevices, there's just going to be a little bit of dust buildup that's extremely important to ground all your shaders. So as you'll see, it's not everywhere. The dust is there, but it's only happening sporadically. So what we're going to do is we're going to make a separate dust shader. So in this top coat, I'm just going to make a V-Ray material. Go back out. I'm just going to drag that as an instance so we can modify it by itself. I'm going to set a kind of desaturated whitish material, something to match this value here. I'm not going to make it reflective, even though in reality it would be. Dust is something that's so noisy and it's got such a blurry reflection that you can barely even tell that reflection is there at all. That's why dust appears to dull reflections on everything. Yet, funnily enough, if you zoomed in at a microscopic level, that dust is just a whole bunch of sand-like particles, and they're just as reflective as any other material in the real world. So if you zoom right in on the crystals of dust, you'll see that they're almost refractive. It's just like a whole bunch of tiny glass with a slight amount of impurities in the refraction. So with that value plugged into the diffuse, all I need to do now is is make a correct blend map. So the dust doesn't need to be that complex. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to blend it in with the V-Ray dirt texture. What that's going to do is it's going to say in the occluded areas, add more dust. So what I have to do to make that happen is, in the occlusion parts, I need to make them white, and in the unoccluded, I need to make them black. So wherever there's this white is showing up in V-Ray's texturing, add in this shader, add in this dust shader. It's something I've always added into shaders right at the end to give them that little bit more grounding. And what it's going to do is, like say underneath parts of the shader ball that are stuck on the surface, it's just going to put a nice little soft layer of dust in there. I need to make this a lot smaller. I'm going to set it to 0.6, the radius, and I'm going to set the distribution to 2. Now once again, all these textures and Burcon, they're going to have their dedicated video which goes through all the settings, just simply affecting one by one what the settings do. So don't worry, I'm not going to leave any of this stuff. I'm just going to condense it all into one video. But for now, what that distribution setting does is it's compressing the gradient that the occlusion's creating. So say if you had a box on the ground and the gradient from the occlusion area to the white area was nice, soft and linear from black to white, adjusting that distribution is going to crunch the blacks closer together. So by setting that to 2, I'm just going to add a little bit of crunch to the texture. Now one important thing now that you know how to use V-Ray correctly is the same idea as always, that the more noise there is, the more work there is for the AA engine. And when you're putting in values that are extremely contrasty, like black and white, you want to increase the subdivs to avoid any extra work being loaded onto the AA engine. So I'm going to set that up to 64 and go out. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to render just a very small region to show you guys that material being plugged into the map. So as that render's finishing up, you can see here that it's just added that little thin dust layer in the surface. Now, to the naked eye, it's barely visible. If I didn't tell you it was there, you wouldn't know it was there. But it's that level of detail, once again, that you need to add in your shaders if you want to get that hyper-real look that you're probably after. Now, it's important to note that even like major studios in the world, they're not using techniques that are this advanced. It's so unknown to people that, I mean, I was surprised, but you can tell. If you go watch the latest Blur cinematic, you can tell that their shaders don't have this level of detail. So if you incorporate what I'm telling you here and you really focus on it and practice it, you'll be creating shaders that are up to par with guys who are working at ILM and even guys at Weta. I mean, they've got a pretty amazing team there and they custom code in a lot of features, but you can always reverse engineer that type of stuff, and that's what I've taken a bit of pride in doing. So I'm going to wrap up the first part of this lesson, which was creating this initial material. I'm just going to render it for you and show you once again all the detail in the shader and compare it to the photo, and we'll wrap up this shader lesson and I'll release the second part in a week's time, which has already been recorded, but I don't want to overload you guys, so I'm going to release that at the same time next week and you guys can continue on from there. So let me just render this for you. So I've just loaded up the final rendered file into Photoshop to compare the two, and you can see they're very similar. The highlight intensity is kind of matching roughly, and even though we're lighting this shader board with a totally different lighting setup, I have put in, you'll notice when you open the scene, I have put in a V-Ray light above to simulate the kind of effect over the top here and to make sure that that's still contributing to the scene. But ultimately it's very close, and I haven't needed to go in and do many re-renders or alter anything because we broke it down as we were going. We got things right as we needed them. So the final little details like the dust in the corners, they just sell it. They just sell that last little bit of, you know, grounding and really make the shader sit in the scene. So this lesson was going to be recorded in one go with the Iron Man material done at the same time, but because of time constraints, I'm going to separate that into its own recording and release that next week. And we'll go into same process as this material, but just using different values and just re-solidifying some of the techniques I've just shown you in how to create accurate real-world materials that stand up at high res. So one last thing I'm going to show you before I finish up the video is just how modular this material can be. So basically, it's a very complex material, and let me just name this dust. But because everything's been separated and blended correctly, if I, oh, there we go, there's a funny thing. In the material, we're missing that diffuse map. I think that happened at one of the crashes I had while recording. But if we go in now and change the diffuse color, it changes it across the entire material. So all of a sudden we can create a totally different material just by adjusting one slider. So there you go. As usual, I hope you learn as much as you can from this stuff. This is really going to put you above other artists in terms of the detail you're getting out of your shaders. So if you just go in and practice it, and I'd really love to see the results that you guys get using this method. Alright, I'll see you guys next time, and we'll be working on the Iron Man material.